everybody, and welcome to another episode of the OSINT Curious Projects Webcast podcast. I am Micah Hoffman, and I am pleased to have a group of my friends here that you probably already know. If you all would, let's go ahead and introduce. The way that we're going to do the introductions, I'm going to point to one of you all and call you out, and then you call out the next person. So we'll start with Nixtintel. Say hi to everybody.
Hi everyone, it's Nixtintel. Really glad you could take time to join us. I'm really looking forward to the podcast or webcast this evening. I'm going to pass you over to the fine Nico.
Hi everybody, Nico, also known as the Dutch OSINT guy here. Let's pick the gumshoe.
Everyone, John TerBush, the gumshoe on Twitter. Thanks for joining us today. I'll kick it over to Kirby.
Oh, you're muted, Kirby.
Hi, I'm muted. And no, hi, I'm Kirby Plessas, and glad to have everybody here. I'm going to kick you off to OSINT Techniques.
Hey everyone, it's Ritu Gill, OSINT Techniques on Twitter. Happy you guys are here to join us on the podcast. Over to Technisette.
Hi everyone, it's Lizette here, or Technisette on Twitter. Happy to have you all here tonight, or today.
And before we introduce our wonderful guest for today, I just want to say thank you to all of our attendees that are here in person with us. Please use the chat function or the QA function to submit your questions to David Tottington. Nico, would you like to go ahead and introduce our guest?
I'd rather have him introduce himself because, I think if you are into the open source intelligence field and you've been in there longer than 5 minutes, you should know the name David Tottington because he has been there for a few decades already, I guess. So with that said, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, it goes back to the days of chalk and slate, actually, before the days of computer. Thanks very much, guys. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real honor, actually, to take part in all of this. My name is David Tottington, and a little bit about my background. It's sort of this weird mishmash of both private and public sector. And I guess the long story short, actually, right out of school, I actually went into television production. I worked in the television industry for about 10 years. My part-time job was following a passion, and really it was a family passion for policing. And I worked as an auxiliary constable with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So my day job initially was in television, which morphed into information technology. And what I did on the evenings and weekends was uniformed police work. Into the IT industry in the very early 1990s. I was a vice president and general manager of one of the national Canadian internet companies, and then kind of got dragged into policing in a pretty big way. I got out of that just before the dot-com bubble burst and started working within the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, now appointed as a supernumerary constable. So I was working in undercover operations, national security investigations section, proceeds of crime section, and numerous other federal sections within the RCMP. All the while, the internet was a really, really new thing. I mean, we're talking about the days of internet relay chat, Usenet news groups, unlike what it is today. And in among all of that, started developing a number of training programs. And these were initially taught at the Canadian Police College, within the RCMP Pacific Region Training Center, and also in the UK. Can't tell by my accent now, but I was actually born in Britain and do travel back and forth a fair amount. Started working at the West Yorkshire Police Training and Development Center there, and it just kind of grew from that point. And these days we do a lot of training pretty much all over the world now in the virtual sphere in the last couple of months, but we do a lot of work within the 5E, so Australia, Britain, Canada, but we also do work in the Middle East, in Africa, in South Asia, and also Southeast Asia as well. And I'm pretty fond of saying the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And it's fascinating working with both private and public sector around the world, because what I end up picking up is a lot of what they're doing right, and maybe what they're doing kind of inefficiently, and then when we try to incorporate that into everything we do. So always a student, I guess, is the short answer there.
Oh, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. The more you get into a field, the more you learn that the field is wider than you thought and you don't know as much. And then I bet every one of us here has that list of things like, oh, I got to get better at cryptocurrency, don't I? And dark web, what the heck is this? So, well, can you tell us a little bit about what parts of OSINT interest you? Maybe not necessarily what your company gets into, but what are you interested within the world of OSINT?
Well, one of the things I find intriguing is we've been at this for a very, very long time now. Like I say, 23 years or so, and you do kind of get entrapped in what works. If it's not broken, don't fix it. So we kind of roll along with a fair degree of success, I guess you could say, and we all kind of get a little bit, I don't want to say lazy, but we kind of get caught in our ruts. For me, something really kind of intriguing happened about 5 years ago. And it kind of ties into what I said about what my initial job was coming right out of school, working in television production. Ended up getting this phone call from London, which in itself wasn't so unusual in the morning. But what was unusual is it was a company called Shine TV, part of the Endemol Shine production group, which is one of the largest television production companies in the world. And the question at the end of the phone was, we've been commissioned by Channel 4 in the UK to do a television series. Do you want to take part? Not exactly the sort of thing that you're expecting to hear over your morning coffee. As it turns out, I was going to be in the UK a couple of weeks later, so I ended up meeting up with the producers. And the concept for the program, and Channel 4, for those not in the UK, it's a state-owned terrestrial television channel that is advertiser supported, and their mandate is to produce innovative television programming. So this is what gave us Big Brother, for example, among many of the reality-based TV shows. So the idea behind the TV program was that a number of people would see if they could go off-grid for a 28-day period, typically a dozen people, and they would sign contracts that, quite honestly, I would never in a million years sign. The end result of it all is a TV program called Hunted. Now, while it's a reality-based, or as they say, constructed drama TV program, and it's done quite well, I look at it as an annual multi-million-pound experiment. So to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of how it works, the people that are chosen to go on the run, and I know season 2 there was something like 22,000 people that applied. They have to provide 6 months worth of bank records, 6 months worth of phone records. They sign contracts that we can do many things. Now in Canada, in the policing world, what we would call a general warrant, which we could apply to the courts for extraordinary investigative powers, covert entries and hacking people and that sort of thing, may be included in a general warrant. We can do all of this. They sign a contract that allows us to do that. They've got 250 pounds to survive with for 28 days. You're not going to be able to do that without relying on friends. 10 of their friends also sign up as well with the same contract. We don't know who these people are. All we get is a name, date of birth, and an address. It goes 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. We're not actors. We're just simply doing our job. It's this mishmash of us brought together from the intelligence world, from the military world, from the policing world, and civilian as well. We've got people that are extremely good at information security and hacking because we can hack them, and also other people that have signed the contract as well. And it just kind of goes from there. So that's the background. And now here's what really I found was something of an epiphany for doing what I do. How often are you ever in a situation where you may be conducting an investigation where it may be pursuing an individual, and maybe you get them, maybe you don't, but how unique is it that at the end of it all, you get to watch the end result, the program, and you get to see what they were doing every day that you were doing what you were doing. Yeah. And what I realized right off the top is how wrong we often got it. And yet in the moment, we believed that we were right. Now, the pressures on this are huge. I have worked on some pretty important mission critical stuff, and there's a lot of pressure associated with that. But imagine you're microphoned up for 12 hours a day. Every word you utter is being recorded. And if you say anything even remotely intelligent, a guy shoves a camera in your face. And the next thing you know, you've got potentially 4 million people watching. And you're thinking in the back of your mind, am I about to commit professional suicide here? it's a lot of pressure. And again, you're lucky in that 12 hours to get a 20-minute break, and it just goes on and on and on. So with all of this, we're under pressure, we're doing our job, we're not actors, we're trying to put the pieces together. As a simulation, it's actually really, really well run, because everything that they're doing out in the field, they've got a television crew with them. That information comes back into a central office, which we call TVC, or Television Command. If we don't ask the right questions, we don't get the right answers. So it actually is really well run as a simulation that I don't know could be truly replicated without a massive, massive budget to be able to do it in this way. We've got 6 teams of 2 people out on the road. We're sort of in London in this headquarters facility. So again, at the end of it all, what I realized is 2 things. We have biases that impact us in much more significant ways than I realized. How many times we thought we had it right, that we knew what these people were doing, that we convinced ourselves of this, and we were wrong, like sometimes really, really wrong. And had it have not been for the fact we were now watching it in a TV program, we may never have known. So would we ever change the way we do what we do? The other aspect of this also is behavioral science. And that was, again, another, I'll call it an epiphany for me, that we weren't spending enough time on the human element of all of this. We weren't spending enough time behaviorally profiling the individuals that we were looking at, trying to predict what they were going to do next. And then, and this was kind of interesting, what about behavioral profiling ourselves? So this is where I started getting really interesting in critical thinking. And then even applying it back to the kind of training we do. You know, we can teach a tool and a technique, but as we often say, it's highly perishable. Technology changes on an almost daily basis. And, you know, if we were to teach someone how to look for a person and we gave them a bullet point list, we're doing a disservice, because the technology will change within weeks, and that is now irrelevant and it's outdated. But how about we teach people how to think? And I guess the idea that give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day, teach a person to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime, I guess that's fundamental to what we do now. And a real passion of mine is, how do we think? And how can we think better as OSINT practitioners doing the investigations and the intelligence projects that we do? How can we think about our thinking while we are thinking it? How can we start to analyze the conclusions?
I want to share it with that.
Yep.
With that line. I want to share it with that line. Sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to have a brief question in between what you were saying.
Because I won't shut up, Nico.
No,
so you gotta jump right in.
No, because I hear you talk about, which is a fairly good point, because I do like the concept of critical thinking. But when I heard you talk about Hunted and the pressure, it was almost not even if it was about critical thinking. It's more about pressure and having to go on a hunch because there is pressure, and not taking the time to take a step back. So
here's what starts to happen is cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are a part of all of us. And when you think about being under a lot of pressure, what happens is the amygdala takes over, the lizard brain, if you will. So we fight or flight reaction, you can experience that in an office. The hypothalamus that does the higher reasoning kind of gets pushed down as the amygdala starts to take over. So you add all of these pressures. And as I say, it's the pressure of feeling like we're going to look like idiots if we don't catch someone after 10 days. We haven't caught anyone. We're doing a TV program. We're going to look like total fools. That's a huge pressure. There's all of these things, and fatigue, for example, and you start kind of going into this autopilot. But autopilot is really dangerous. This idea of going on a hunch. Well, what is a hunch? How do we break that down? Is it part of our upbringing? Is it part of our culture? We start taking into account the dynamic of groupthink, the hive mentality. Thinking is hard work. It takes a lot of energy. As Henry Ford once said, thinking is hard work, which is why a lot of people don't do it. And it's exhausting and tiring, and sometimes it's easy just to kind of rely on your colleagues to let them do some of the thinking for a little while. Yeah. So I often say it's what is critical thinking? It's thinking about your thinking while you are thinking it. I guess, as Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, know yourself and know your enemy, 1,000 battles to be won. How well do you know yourself and your own thought process? How aware are you of your own biases? And then the other thing I would say about critical thinking, and I guess, Nico, this speaks to what I think you're alluding to here, when we go on hunches, I would describe critical thinking as skepticism without cynicism. And there's a big difference between the two. That there is a difference between having a healthy skepticism and then being really cynical about something, because we can miss some really important things in our cynicism.
Yeah, I agree. So what's your opinion on techniques like, because you just talked about critical thinking, like the analysis of competing hypotheses, for instance, because those could really good work to be your own devil's advocate.
Yeah, well, this is it. The alternative competing hypothesis is important. Now, the idea is that we work from data, we group data together to get information, and then we contextualize the information. So we use our inductive and our deductive reasoning skills to form a hypothesis. And Nico, what you're bringing up here is important, testing out that hypothesis and trying an alternative. We actually refer to the person we get to do that within our organizations, the DA. We say to the client, it's the devil's advocate, where we really internally refer to them as the designated a-hole. But the point is that if you get two people with a similar degree of training, give them the same data sets, they should come to the same conclusion at the end of it all, rather than wildly different conclusions. So that's one way of employing ACH, or alternative competing hypotheses. But it's really, really important that we're constantly thinking, why did I come to these conclusions? What is my process? Am I missing something? And not just how the pieces fit together. As we start talking about biases, we get into things like confirmation bias. We see what we want to see, but not just the relevance of what's there, but what is the relevance of what is missing? So then we get into a process of applying logical thought and then creative thought. Creative thinking is when we're considering the relevance of what's not there. So it's an interesting process.
Can I come in and kind of focus this a little bit toward what some of the stuff that's been going on Twitter in the last couple of days? So for example, as analysts, a lot of us have already gone through some sort of cognitive bias training, but the world as a whole clearly does not, right? And so like you have an example of some guy who apparently like assaulted a young girl on a biking trail in DC. I don't know if you saw that in the DC area, and the internet went wild and they picked one person, and then that person turned out not to be it. Then they picked another person, and then it wasn't either of those people. And so they didn't, there's no verification, no cognitive bias issues, that they're addressing themselves. How do you teach the crowd?
Yeah, I personally feel that critical thinking has never been more important than it is now. Here's something to maybe consider, and maybe we talk about cynicism, skepticism. Here's one of the things that I consider when it comes to social media, and I guess maybe we're all responsible. We've only got so much cognitive energy in the course of the day. Social media has been taking over from media for quite some time. And a lot of us, we're addicted to our devices. The average North American spends 6 to 8 hours a day on their devices. Where do we go for our news now? Social media. Social media is extremely well put together. Its job in this attention-based economy is to engage us. That is the job of social media. The more engagement they can create, the longer we spend on that platform, then the more susceptible we are to targeted advertising, which raises revenue for them. So we are the product, as Marshall McLuhan said. Now, with that being said, what's the easiest way to appeal to someone? What's the easiest way to engage someone? Outrage. And Kirby, your example is a really good one. That video that started circulating around, it generates outrage. It generates engagement. Maybe this is a cynical view, but that keeps people engaged on a social media platform. And I think we've all got to be very much more aware of this than we've ever been before. I mean, it's now becoming more and more and increasingly well known that we have actors that are even state-sponsored creating massive farms of bots to alter conversation. And you consider these behavioral elements that start getting incorporated into this, and it's a pretty frightening world we live in. The way that we propagate information, we don't even read articles. It just somehow the headline catches us in a way that appeals to our biases, and we immediately forward it on without reading it. And then conversation starts to develop in amongst our social circles. And here's something else about groupthink. Our views become more strongly reinforced when we are in a group of like-minded individuals. So within the little enclaves of social media in which you reside, think about the way that you are also being influenced by the like-minded people in your social circles. So it's a massive challenge. And I think we've all got to take some responsibility here and start thinking quite a bit differently in terms of the amount of information we are bombarded with.
Can I ask you just a sort of follow-on question from that, Dave? You're absolutely right. You've hit the nail on the head about the problem of cognitive bias, especially on Twitter. But for people who are aspiring or practicing OSINT investigators, how do you deal with that? How do you train yourself to think critically? How do you train yourself to deal with your cognitive biases? Because we know.
Exactly. There are a number of really good training programs out there. Now, that being said, they're not always driven towards investigators, so they can start to become very, very academic. I know myself, as I started getting really passionate and interested in this, it became a study of just about everything, including behavioral economics, philosophy, for example. It was a whole lot. And with the average OSINT practitioner, I mean, we're a training company, and we thought, okay, there needs to be some training courses around this. So that's our job, to figure all of this out. But for the average OSINT practitioner, that's a big thing to start taking on. There are some books I would recommend: Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. One book titled Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink is another book that I would recommend, and even Daniel Gardner's book The Science of Fear. It's a fascinating read, especially when we consider the world of terrorism, counterterrorism, the way that our fears act. So what we call availability heuristic. It's a natural cognitive bias that we, for example, the example I often use, what are you more afraid of, a shark attack? If you're visiting somewhere that's tropical and nice, are you more afraid of dying as a result of a shark attack or getting hit in the head with a coconut? 15 times more people die every year from getting hit in the head with a coconut falling from a palm tree than die by shark attack. But what is it that gets our attention? Gardner makes an interesting point in his book, again, The Science of Fear, and that is that we are actually living in a time where we've never been safer. Our life expectancy is longer than it's ever been. Our standard of living is higher than it's ever been, and yet it seems that we've never been so afraid. Fear is a massive thing. So understanding all of these things is really quite important. Understanding how we think. How is it that I am coming to the conclusions that I am coming to as an OSINT practitioner? Why am I coming to these conclusions? Because keep in mind, you're commissioned to do an intelligence report, an investigation. The client, whatever that is, it might be your boss, it could be an independent client, they may be heavily relying on what you've put together. They're going to expect that you've done the critical thinking, and now they're going to be relying on that. They're busy, they've got a lot to deal with. They may be taking action on something that is fundamentally wrong. That is a massive responsibility.
David,
we all have to carry that.
One of our attendees has asked, do you have some, I'm guessing, free online resources, books or websites or other things that you know of that you suggest so that people can learn about how to avoid these biases and how to do sound logical thinking?
Yeah, there's a number of good YouTube videos that are out there on critical thinking. Some have been put together by, there's actually something called Wi-Fi, W-I-P-H-I, which is actually wireless philosophy. And you get, now, again, this can become quite academic, but you get instructors, professors from the University of Cambridge, the University of Toronto. Again, it can be a bit of a stretch sometimes to, okay, I need to get down to the brass tacks for the open source intelligence work I do. So there's a lot of things like that out there. As I say, the books, the reading is really important as well. We ourselves do drop-in and learn sessions every week, dropinandlearn.org. So free webinars, much like you guys are doing. In fact, Nico was a guest recently and Kirby was a guest recently, talking about different things. And again, we incorporate a lot of the critical thinking into that. You can see it on YouTube as well. So we've got Dr. Hugh Hervey, who's one of our associates. He's a clinical psychologist with a subspecialty in forensic psychology, getting into the discussion around what cognitive biases are and how, as we take on a question, how that question is presented to us is going to have a significant impact on how we undergo the investigation or the project itself. We are going to be primed, if you will, psychologically primed by the way a question is asked. So we actually have to get into a process of deconstructing the question in the first place.
And so is this, I would imagine that this is not a one-time, I've learned about cognitive bias and now I'm immune forever. I would imagine that as time goes on, this is one of those trainings or topics that you need to get back into and re-examine. Is that right?
Absolutely. You know, I think just in life, we are always learning. And as I say, the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. I think the most dangerous people out there are the ones that think they know it all. You know, we got to be really careful about that. So yeah, I think to have that natural curiosity is a really important thing. And again, like I say, my own study of this over the past 4 or 5 years has taken me into things like behavioral economics. Like, why do we make the decisions to purchase certain things we do? Well, if that can be manipulated, then how is it we are making the decisions we make in an investigation? And we get into, you may have heard of fear of missing out or FOMO, fear of a better option. Is that an issue as well? Are we a maximizer or are we a satisficer in terms of the decision making that we undertake? Are we looking for the middle road, or are we slightly more risk taking as an individual? You can see how this requires a lot of self-reflection to be able to sort out how is it I make the decisions I do, and are those the right decisions?
Yeah. One of our attendees has asked the question, if we can go back to your work on Hunted, I'm sorry. What was one of your favorite moments from that show? Obviously, there were some challenging, stressful moments, but do you have something that like stands out?
Yeah, you know, there's a lot actually, and it almost becomes this flurry. It's such an intense experience that it is exhausting. I mean, like I say, and I am not exaggerating when you're talking about a 12-hour day that's absolutely pressurized, and when it gets edited, you know, there are thousands of hours in the end of video, and the story has to kind of be dumbed down. It has to make sense to the average television viewer who is maybe not paying a lot of attention, and it's got to be edited in a way that keeps people engaged, that edge of the seat. There's so much work that goes in that you never ever see. Some really, really good detective work. There were times when I looked around that room and I thought, what an incredibly talented team of people that we've got here. People I learned a huge amount from as well. Some of the funny things, I guess if I was to pick one, and if anyone here has served as a police officer and you've been in uniform, it's kind of funny. So I'll preface it by saying this. The concern at the time was no one will ever believe this. Funny though, when you play this to a room full of cops, they all start nodding their heads and going, yep, that's just how it works, isn't it? This was season 1, and we had 2 of our sort of ground hunters, Nick Thorne and Danny Brooke, and they were up in Norfolk and looking around a caravan park or a trailer park. And we were actually looking for 2 fugitives that were completely different than what actually happened. They were driving along and they noticed a couple of people up ahead. Suddenly their eyes went wide, they bolted, they started running. And again, in the police world, you see this all the time when you're not driving around a police car. Anyway, they start bolting and running. I thought, that's strange. They drove this black BMW SUV that they were driving over to the caravan that they jumped into, and they could see people closing curtains and everything else. So they decided to go knock on the door. You know, now again, we've got to be really careful because we don't know who this is exactly. But they go knock on the door, and it was 2 of the fugitives. It was a complete surprise. We had no clue that they were actually there. We hadn't been focusing on them at all. And they opened the door and then immediately gave up. It was the weirdest thing ever. And I know that for the producers, they were thinking, how on earth are we ever going to make this believable? Because it looks like a complete setup. And yet, like I say, for cops in the room, it's just like, yep. How often does that happen, right? It happens a lot. But lots of things like that.
One of the other questions from that same person that asked the question about that was there a favorite OSINT technique or some kind of geolocation tool or something that you found really helpful from the OSINT perspective that was really very effective, if you're willing to share it online?
Yeah, it's an interesting process because we're in this situation that we wouldn't be in any other world, typically speaking, and that is we can hack people. We can start breaking into people's accounts, into their Facebook accounts. We can seize their devices and break into those. Some of the things I learned: never, ever, ever, ever store a password in your browser that you care about. The ease with which, and it was a bunch of guys from a company called NCC that do all of the hacking, the ease in which they were able to get through that was unbelievably easy. And then once we had certain passwords, we got into absolutely everything. Security questions, we were able to guess the answer of a lot of security questions because people invariably post it out there. We forget this tangled web that we weave that becomes our digital tattoo. That was really quite fascinating as well. I found just going back to the basics and trying to approach it, like, think of it not just working in a little bubble, but constantly talking to the people around us. Because again, we had people that were the deputies who were really boots on the ground tactical people. We had intelligence analysts, we had the hackers, all of this sort of thing. It's a constant process of throwing ideas around and getting fuel for the fire, so to speak. If it was just isolated OSINT, it's going to be kind of hard, actually.
So would you say this was like an adversarial emulation for, hey, we have an imminent threat of attack of an adversary or a terrorist, and you would assemble this kind of tiger team and everybody come together? But it sounds like some not illegal things in this case, but some things that law enforcement and normal people wouldn't normally do in an investigation. So how would you?
Yeah. I think it would be certainly on a higher level law enforcement investigation. It would be the sort of thing we would do. So if we, for example, identify someone is they've got an Apple account, some of the things that we would then do is we would then put in a request, so to speak, to Television Command that we want the details of their Apple account. In the law enforcement world, we may do that. Now, and we get information back if it's available, if it's possible to give it to us. If they've got that information, they'll provide us with or clues that can assist us because we're on the right path, and we should receive some kind of a reward for doing it that way. It's a touchy thing, really, but it actually is run, I was just really quite well and realistically. To use your term,
can I ask one question about?
Yeah, please do.
That Hunted, because I've watched the Dutch version of Hunted, and well, I'm an ex-law enforcement guy. I've done a lot of intelligence, and I had a lot of the ahas, and I wish I had that stuff available immediately when I needed it. But what also the hacking stuff, because I did see a screenshot of Empire, for instance, and that's a tool you use to, infiltrate someone else's machine, right? So I would like, how are you going to explain that legally to normal people watching TV?
I know, and here's what happens is it gets dumbed down in the edit. It has to. I mean, it's got to be made understandable. Now this was amongst those of us working on the program that we didn't reveal any tradecraft or start engaging or talking about tradecraft that might be used in the real world that was not in the public domain. I mean, we're just not going to do that. The other aspect of that is Nico, is it's an interesting reversal, because there was probably just as many moments of frustration where we were saying, come on, in the real world, we would get this. Yeah. But the simulation wasn't constructed in a way that actually facilitated that. And it was a point of real frustration for us, because we could argue, well, yeah, in the real world, this is what we would get based on this request. It gets tense sometimes. So there's no question that the tensions can run very, very high. Everyone's tired, working at a ridiculous pace. There's a lot of pressure, and tempers were known to flare on occasion.
Yeah, sounds like an interesting project to participate in. Really interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely fascinating.
As you mentioned earlier, this is an investigation you're conducting that's amazingly well documented, right? You can do an after action on it later. So you got the critical thinking piece from that as a key thing that's like, I should focus on this more. Were there a couple other little takeaways from being able to, you know, as an investigator, I know, you know, you find this stuff and you maybe never even know what the client does with it or whatever. You have this full 360 view of what's going on. Were there a couple other takeaways there?
Sort of and sort of not. You know, there's some very specific rules as far as the simulation goes, if we want to call it a simulation. The fugitives are, you know, we're making a TV show. That's our mission at the end of the day. If we catch everyone in 4 days flat, they don't have a lot to work with. You know, so that's not going to work. So there's certain things that are put in place to kind of inhibit us, to make our jobs more difficult, to build the story up in an interesting way, to develop the characters and all of that kind of thing. I would suggest that there's a lot that we don't see in the final edit. I recall that the rules is that we weren't allowed to have any contact with these people after the program. And then actually for 6 months after the final episode had aired, only then could we ever get in contact with people. It became pretty personal sometimes because, you know, again, tension is high. These individuals, they are basically trying to win £100,000. That's life-changing money at the end of it. Well, in the UK, it's distributed amongst anyone who makes it to the extraction point at the very end. You can imagine. One of the things I found interesting, and again, the critical thinking process, and we think about things like actor-observer asymmetry. Actor-observer asymmetry is, what would I do if I was them? Well, here's the thing. You're not them and you don't think the way they do. So you got to get into their head and start predicting what they're going to do based on their unique personality traits. With this in mind, I was really interested in reaching out to a few of the people, some who I had a great deal of respect for at the end of the whole program. It was pretty interesting. Some, they were mad, angry. We were the enemy still, didn't want to talk. Some people I had no interest in talking to because, again, it became quite personal. There was a few people that I did meet with. And of course, over a beer in London somewhere, the questions I've got is, what was it like? What was it like to be on the run? Because, of course, I'm going through in my mind, what are the key learning points here? And what can we do differently? And how can this apply to the real world investigations too? And the one thing that didn't occur to me that inevitably came back is the level of paranoia was beyond anything that they ever thought they could possibly experience. It's a TV show. You're working 12 hours a day. You know, at 8 p.m., if you're in the middle of a field, guess what? You're bedding down in that field. But as they got closer and closer to the end, and this money is there, and they're tired, and they're hungry, and they're filthy, and they're having to rely on their wits, that constant looking over the shoulder, never knowing when we were there, that I found interesting. And that was, to be honest, the first time I heard that, it was a bit unexpected. But then I realized this was a common theme. So again, the mentality of the individual, putting yourself in their place, empathy, I guess is what it comes down to, being aware of actor-observer asymmetry. What is their life like? What are the pressures on them right now? And don't apply it to what you would do in that circumstance. What is their background? We have one guy who grew up in the Somalian refugee camps. Imagine how he's going to deal with that kind of pressurized situation as opposed to someone who grew up in a middle-class neighborhood and never really experienced any hardship in their life. Completely different way of dealing with it. So it's fascinating stuff. I think much more than you'd ever get on the program itself just by watching it.
Well, and I love that you didn't just focus on the open source intelligence. You just didn't focus on the law enforcement. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, which I try to, you try to think about how people would interact with computers, and then therefore how we can harvest that data or otherwise find them or find the answers to our OSINT questions. So I love the interesting psychology things that you did there.
Well, and I guess I didn't realize how long we're running on this one. Another thing I would suggest that became extremely powerful is NORA, non-obvious relationship analysis. What we've got are people that are trying to scrub obvious relationships, and yet these are people that they're going to be relying on, and how they are going to get these people to help them as they get into the simulation. Really knowing NORA, trying to piece together, how do these people know each other? What is the relationship? What relationships, like a technique we saw very frequently is people that were reaching out to individuals, associates that they may have known 15 years ago and haven't been in contact since. And let's face it, when you're doing a TV show and the program's known, to be able to say, hey, I'm on this TV show, I can win 100,000 pounds, do you want to help me? There's all kinds of other psychological factors that come into it with, oh, I'm going to be taking part in something pretty cool here. How often do I get to do that? If they were real criminals, I would suggest that would be quite a different situation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for David. Any last questions for David, or time to shift to the news? Go ahead, Nico.
One question we always ask each and every guest. What is one thing?
Should I be nervous, Nico?
Yes, you should.
Okay. All right.
No. This is a question we ask each and every guest. What's the one thing you are now planning on to learn that you have never come to learn OSINT-wise?
I am fascinated by as Micah was just mentioning there, the psychology, behavioral science, and I just feel like I've scratched the surface. I'm just now going down into that rabbit hole. We just can't be good at absolutely everything. And even Nico, you and I were talking fairly recently. You were bringing up, various tools I know nothing about. I just don't have those technical chops. I think this is what's interesting is OSINT is so broad. There can't ever be an OSINT practitioner that knows absolutely everything, but it's this bringing together different areas of expertise. And that's where I see the real magic happening, when you can bring together. And this is why I think programs like this are so very important, to build these connections, to build these networks. And when you're faced with a challenge, that there are people that have expertise in that area to be able to lend their expertise into that. Not to just think of this as a technical process, not to just think of this as a Google thing, but there's so much to it.
Yeah, well, I think we couldn't agree more.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, David Tottington, for being on. This is David's Twitter account. It's Tottington INT. And again, we will put this in the show notes. And thank you, Kirby, for finding this link. I think you were the one that popped this in. On Tottington.com, there's the Drop In and Learn webcasts, which are webcasts that you can participate in to learn more about open source intelligence, or other things like this next one coming up on last Thursday, retro. Next Thursday is Cyber Risks During COVID, Small and Medium Business Edition.
And actually, Micah, if you just scroll down a little bit, one that I'll point out here, if you're interested in Hunted, just one more further here. Okay, this one on the 29th of June, that you're just scrolling by there, Kevin O'Leary is actually the referee from Hunted, a former chief superintendent with the Metropolitan Police, and he serves as the referee on Hunted. So he's the guy who decides what we get, what we don't get. We haven't really made mention of it in the Drop In and Learn session here, but I'm sure that's going to come into the conversation. And Kevin has really adopted with his team at Red Leadership sort of the lessons learned from running that simulation into creating management training programs to get people to think more effectively in high pressure situations.
That's terrific. Well, I look forward to attending some of these myself. Thank you, David Tottington. And
thank you very much, guys.
Please stick around if you'd like as we go through the news and some of these other things. We'd love to hear your impressions too. So on to the news. And one of the things that we are thrilled to announce is that we have a new sponsor named Neon Century. Neon Century Intelligence, which is a UK firm. Go Nix. Well, I mean, you're the UK representative here, right? So I gotta say go Nix. But a Neon Century, and we also have a new Patreon, Michelle Stewart, I think is how we pronounce that. Thank you to you both for joining our project and helping us move on. Some of the things that happened in the past 2 weeks, our big guy Nico over here wrote a blog post about vicarious trauma. Nico, you wanna sum it up and tell the people about it a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a blog called Vicarious Trauma and OSINT, a practical guide. This is something that has been on my mind for several years because it's a subject which, in my opinion, that doesn't get talked about that much, or doesn't get traction, or doesn't get recognized by employers, for instance, and it is real. I've experienced it in my career, doing open source intelligence, being tasked with counterterrorism, and well, I talked briefly about it. What I found important in pointing out in this particular blog is that for each and every one who likes to do open source intelligence, online research, online journalistic work, whatever you want to call it, as long as you look at footage or content that could traumatize you, because, well, you might see blood, you might see decapitations, you might see shootings, you might see car incidents, whatever. Even though it's not happening to you, it could impact you, and you should never deny the feelings you get from seeing this footage, or hearing this content, or reading up on something. It's something that can crawl under your skin, and I know from experience that this happens, and it happens a lot, especially with people in our field, because they look at a screen most of the time 9 to 10 hours a day, doing this because they are highly motivated and tenacious about doing this, forgetting about themselves, forgetting to take a step away, forgetting to reflect on this. And this is where my, well, let's say blog was all about, just making people aware, and hopefully also employers aware, that this is a real thing and we should all take very seriously. And what I found really interesting is that I got a lot of feedback. This was an actual blog where a lot of people reached out personally to me through email, Twitter DM, saying, well, I'm so happy you made this blog. Now I can finally talk about it, or it made me aware that it has impacted me, or I am sleepless, I am stressed out. So I didn't expect that much of feedback, which I really like, but it also kind of hurts to hear that people are hurting because they are just trying to do their jobs at best they can.
Well, but you've put a name to it, and you've helped them identify the symptoms. And in the blog post, can you give us like one of the suggestions that you had for people that are experiencing this vicarious trauma?
Yeah. Well, what I know from personal experience, especially when I was doing counterterrorism, where you see those horrific graphic events happening during wartime, let's say in Syria during the Islamic State rise, I would like to go outside and watch, for instance, footage outside with the birds and the sunlight in my face, just because it makes it less intense. Or I would put off my headphones and lower the volume of the footage, or maybe tune it off. Those are things that are just minor things, but that can help from really getting the footage into your brain and into your soul, and just looking at it from, let's say, kind of a distance, and talking about it. That really helps.
Thanks, Nico. That's an important article. Thanks for writing it, really. And if you do have questions about that article, about the vicarious trauma, please reach out to Nico or any one of us for some resources or whatever we can do to help you out.
Yep.
Next, we have something that Nix, I think you were the one that posted this, about some BBC News people like our very own Benjamin Strick, who did some fact-checking on a Harvard study about COVID. You want to tell us about it?
Yeah, this is really interesting because it was an OSINT study that was debunked by another OSINT study, and it kind of ties into some of what David was saying about cognitive biases and just accepting the first answer and availability error and the rest. But the story of this is a team from Harvard University were trying to find out via open source when they thought the COVID outbreak might have started in China. So they looked at satellite photos of hospital car parks, and they did they used Baidu, but they checked for search trends on Baidu over a period of time. So when people were Googling or using Baidu to search for symptoms of coronavirus, and they put the search results together with the hospital car park photos, and they concluded that probably the coronavirus outbreak started in China as way back in August last year. And that study got a lot of traction. I mean, it came from Harvard, and some major politicians retweeted it, so it became widely accepted. And actually, Ben and his team at the BBC dug into this a little bit more, and they said, well, actually, we can explain the car parks, that you didn't see a lot of cars in the car park at this hospital because they're underground. And actually the search terms that they were checking for on, as being trending, when you translated them back into Chinese, didn't mean what we thought they meant. And actually the searches for trends related to coronavirus actually went down in the time period once it did the translation work. So it's using OSINT to check other OSINT, but it's that just not taking things at surface value and really be willing to dig down and consider the other side of an argument as well. It's a really good piece, and shows the importance of checking stuff.
I love the fact that it was using OSINT to fact check something that was billed as OSINT, right? I mean, we have good intentions sometimes, but sometimes we have motivations, that confirmation bias that, again, David was talking about, that lead us down a path, and we don't look for other alternatives. So great article. Thank you for sharing that with us. Nico, I think you were the one that put this in. No, it wasn't you.
No,
was
I think it was Gumshoe.
That was me.
All right. WhatsApp phone numbers in Google search results. Tell us more.
Yeah, this is just a researcher had figured out that basically if you set your settings on WhatsApp a certain way, that you could do a search by phone number and find these things. So, just one of these other things where you have to be careful about your information. And on the flip side, if you're doing things to find people, doing investigations, keep an eye out for these sorts of resources. This might be another place to check that phone number you've got.
Yeah, good call, man.
What I found interesting, I tried this particular search just to test how it turns out, especially targeted to the Netherlands. And I think almost all of the results I got were from governmental WhatsApp accounts or NGO accounts. So I've started to think that maybe this particular way is a way to share openly how people can contact you through WhatsApp. So it's a kind of link. Yeah,
it's not like a be-all, end-all. Basically, you need to configure it to share the information. But we know how many people mistakenly configure things. So
yeah, absolutely.
You might get lucky, right?
Yeah, it's like the Google Calendar, where people can, bars and health clubs create Google Calendars, and then they share it with the world. And a lot of the Google Calendars out there are like, hey, I found a calendar, but it's meant to be public. But then you get people that share out their private calendars. Kirby?
Right. And that sort of thing, it's an opt-in thing, but you see that across all over. So you said Google Calendar, but like Nest cameras, you want to share your Nest camera with someone, make sure that Google can't get to wherever you shared it, right? Same thing, even with, you opt into that snap code thing on Snapchat, and those codes end up going on the Snapchat website. And that's pretty much the only thing you can Google dork off of Snapchat. So. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all. Nix, tell us about this. What I love that you've been doing is you've been sharing ways that people can take control over some of the tools and the techniques that they use, whether it's creating the Unix virtual machine, the Linux virtual machine for OSINT platforms, or here you mentioned archivebox.io. Can you tell us a little bit about what it does?
Yeah, this is great. This is my new favorite open source tool at the moment. We're all familiar with internet archives, like archive.org or archive.s is like a cornerstone of most sort of open source investigation. This is a new tool, Archivebox, which basically runs on your local machine, and it allows you to build your own internet archive. It's still in beta, so it's not quite a finished product, but it runs locally on your own machine. It's still got a lot of functionality. I've been playing with it for about a week. Once you've set it up, you can basically point it to a website or a list of websites, and it will build full offline archives of those sites, which if you've ever tried to do that yourself is actually quite hard, because modern sites have a lot of video content, they have a lot of JavaScript, so the scraping and copying is really difficult. But if you point it at a website, it will do a screenshot for you. It will save the website as a PDF. It will save it as a fully viewable offline HTML document with all the video and JavaScript built in. And you can automate it if you want to visit a site over and over and over again to build a record of a site over time. It's great. And you can even point it at your browser history. So I can point it, if I do a day's browsing on Firefox, I can point it to my browser history, and over a few minutes, it will build a full offline archive of every page I've visited. So you can manage and share your own Internet Archive, which as an investigator doing that course is absolutely brilliant. You're not reliant on the third party. I know you can already do that with archive.org or archive.is, but you don't control that. And if that's gone, then you've lost it. But you can do it locally on your own machine and navigate it all through the web interface. It's really, really good.
That's really cool resource. And it's free, right?
It is free, yeah. It's clone it from GitHub. It's available on GitHub. It runs on Linux and Mac, and it will run on Windows if you can get it to run with Docker. But yeah, it runs natively on Linux.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. A link that Sector 035, who's normally on here but couldn't be with us today, just throw in some drone footage. If you are somebody that's looking for aerial footage of an area, check out soar.earth. I played around with it for a little bit, and I'm just going to go ahead and look at Technisette's house here. Let's see. Yeah, so I mean, this is some really neat footage, and again, this is different than satellite footage. These are mostly from, I believe, drones and quadcopters and the like. And it's watermarked with all of their logos. But just looking at this and zooming in, many times can get you different perspectives, more recent perspectives of certain areas. So, of course, that's not Technisette's house, or is it?
I would wish.
All right, and then let's see. So we have another resource that was posted, Dark Basin, uncovering a massive hack for hire operation. Was Nix or Nico?
I'm clueless about this one. I didn't put it in.
No? All right, then we move on. Oh, go ahead.
We can move on. This is just an interesting thing where there are, guys out there doing OSINT maybe for not the best purposes. And it's an interesting case study of the interconnectedness of businesses and politics and, investigations and the kinds of work that we do, sometimes not completely on the level in this case.
Well, thanks, Gumshoe. Appreciate it. Didn't mean to slight you there. Lastly, we've got some Facebook things that have been happening. Kirby, you want to talk a little bit about your tweets and what you found?
Yeah, so this tweet is kind of just, I pushed it out after a little bit of back and forth with me, you, Technisette, talking privately about what kind of things are available out there on Facebook as far as with those old formulas. Now, this isn't the new Facebook base 64 translation at all. It's just some of those old formulas. And I think originally there was a link that somebody had shared on how to find, who likes a certain page that's available, but it wasn't this. And I had thought that, oh yeah, it's the same thing as something was shared to me earlier where you can actually find, which of your friends like a certain page on Facebook. So then I just kind of went down a wormhole of, well, what other of those type of formulas still work? And I ended up putting a bunch on my website. So if you go to my plessas.net/Facebook matrix, you can see down at the bottom before the graph. Yeah, so just go ahead and go to plessas.net. And then in the resources, choose my Facebook matrix. And like I said, you're going to have to scroll down quite a bit. It's really unorganized right now. I have to reorganize this whole page. But if you go to a little bit further down, that group is a chunk of stuff right there. Those are some of the older ones that still work. The ones that what I really am looking for is I want to find who likes a certain page. I found what pages a certain person like, what pages are connected to for other pages. And then of course you can see right in the middle, there's one that says friended fans of. Do you see that one? Yeah, that's the one where you can see which of your fans like a page. And my goal is to find where's the one that's without the friends, just fans of, because that's the thing that's kind of missing in a lot of the Facebook search since the switch over. And I figure if this exists, it has to exist as well. So if anybody ever figures that out, send me a message. I would love it.
Yeah, and check out Kirby's page, which is, like you said, constantly being updated with some of the latest stuff on Facebook. And thanks for doing that research and sharing it with us, Kirby.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, you've gone through a whole nother hour here with us talking about OSINT, interviewing David Tottington. Thank you, everybody, for coming. David, thank you so much for coming on and just helping us to understand more about critical thinking, about your experiences on Hunted. It was fascinating. Really appreciate you coming aboard.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure, and I'm a huge fan of all of you guys. So it's nice to finally be here and actually be able to participate and add something. So thank you.
You are most welcome. All right. Well, we are at the end of our show where we do that shameless self-promotion stuff. I'm going to go ahead and go first this time and just tell you that I've got some SANS classes that are going on, and they are live online classes, not quite doing in-person classes yet for the SANS Sec 487 class, but we're getting there. We're coming up close. And I'm going to tag somebody, and that person can do shameless self-promotion or just log off or just say goodbye. I'm going to tag Ritu Gill. Ritu, you want to say it, and you want to tell anybody where they can find you?
Yeah, so hey everyone, I'm mostly active on Twitter. My handle is OSINT Techniques, and I also have a website, OSINTtechniques.com. Yeah, and I just wanted to mention something, not to do with me, but the resource that was shared through SANS, the must-have free resources for open source intelligence. I thought that was a good one, Micah.
Cool. Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of neat, but there you go.
Cool. All right, Ritu, who do you want to go next? Your choice.
Let's go Kirby. You're on mute.
You're muted, Kirby.
So thank you. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Curbster, and I also have some classes coming up, webinars, and a fraud seminar coming up in 2 weeks. I'm going to kick it over to Gumshoe.
Nothing real immediate for me coming up, but obviously keep an eye on the SANS schedule for any OSINT classes that I might be teaching, as well as Micah or Nico. And again, I'm the Gumshoe on Twitter.
Who do you want to go next?
I'm going to Dutch OSINT guy.
Oh, it's me. No, I've got nothing especially to promote. If you want to see where I'm at or where I'm planned to be, you can take a look at my website, dutchosintguy.com, or at my Twitter handle.
Call somebody out, Nico. You got Nix or Technisette?
Technisette.
Well, I'll be speaking this Friday on a virtual conference called, it's probably not going to be pronouncing right, but it's the Recherche Networks something. It's in Germany. So everything will be German except for my speech. And Ray is going to be speaking as well. I will be speaking on Facebook for a full hour. And Ray will be covering corporate intelligence and how to do OSINT on businesses. Further on, I've got a new website on. So go to technisette.com and see my brand new shiny websites. And everything on Facebook. I have a thread now on my Twitter account where I keep track of all of the changes I find between the new and the old design of Facebook. You haven't
share
seen
that
it,
with Nico so he can put it in the show notes.
I will. I'll just put one in there because I forgot that this morning I found out that there is a difference between searching in groups in the old and in the new design. So I'm not touching the base64 and the JSON, but I'm just looking at the visual search. Okay. So I'll make sure to get it to Nico. So hopefully see you guys anywhere, either on Twitter, my website, or maybe Friday on the virtual conference.
All right, Nix.
Over to Nix.
Thank you.
Okay, last of all, I have nothing special to promote this time, but I will be on Twitter, as always, at Nixtintel, or my website, nixtintel.info.
And David, I'll give you a chance. Is there anything that you want to promote or shout out to?
Sure. Actually, if you're interested in resources, if you go to Tottington.com/resources, we've got about 2,000 different OSINT resources that are broken down into about 30 different categories. So kind of a database that if you're looking for some free resources to do some searching, you can check out there. And we're constantly and always, we're probably primarily a training company more than anything else. So We have a lot of training courses coming up on critical thinking, dark web, advanced OSINT techniques. We have e-learning, so self-paced study, as well as remote training, and even hybrid as well. So it's a combination of remote and also e-learning as well. So yeah, you can just check that out at Tottington.com and wander around there and see what you can see. But thank you very much.
Good. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you, panelists, for being here. And thank you to all of our attendees that have helped us ask David questions and all. And thank you to our listeners on our podcast. And there's just one thing left to tell them, everybody, and that is,
Hey,
OSINT, serious. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.